Hi, boys and girls. Helen McCrane here again. Today with a story for you by Ringgold Wilbur Lardner, better known as Ring Lardner. Now, Lardner was a writer, a journalist during the early part of the 20th century, and he wrote from the late teens up through the roaring 20s and into the early part of the 1930s. He was best known at the time as a sports writer, but Lardner didn't just confine himself to sports, and his prose style was admired by some of the foremost writers of his generation. Dorothy Parker and William Faulkner both claimed to be influenced by Lardner. Now, Lardner didn't just write stories. He wrote songs and lyrics and librettos, and he collaborated on Broadway musicals with, among others, George S. Kaufman. Thank you very much. Lardner loved music and the theater, and he was a keen observer of the Broadway scene, and he wrote about it with great affection, great humor. And it is one of those stories that I am going to read for you today. So, in honor of the era, why don't you light up an imaginary Jaguar cigarette, mix up a pitcher of real martinis, stirred, not shaken. You don't want to bruise the gin. And sit back, relax, and I hope enjoy Liberty Hall by Ring Lardner. My husband is in Atlantic City, where they're trying out Dear Dora, the musical version of David Copperfield. My husband wrote the score. He used to take me along for these out-of-town openings, but not anymore. He, of course, has to spend all his time in the theater, and that leaves me alone in the hotel, and pretty soon people find out whose wife I am, and introduce themselves, and the next thing you know, they're inviting us for a week or a weekend at Dobbs Ferry or Oyster Bay. And then it's up to me to think of some legitimate-sounding reason why we can't come. In lots of cases, they say, well, if you can't make it on the 22nd, how about the 29th? And so on. And, well, until you finally have to accept. And Ben gets mad and stays mad for days. He absolutely abhors visiting and thinks there ought to be a law against invitations that go beyond dinner and bridge. He doesn't mind hotels where there's a decent light for reading in bed and one for shaving, and where you can order meals with coffee anytime you want them. But I really believe he would rather spend a week in the death house at Sing Sing than in somebody else's home. 3 or 4 years ago, we went around quite a lot with a couple whom I will call the Buckleys. We liked them, and they liked us, and we had dinner together at least twice a week, and after dinner we played bridge, or we went to a show, or just sat and talked. Ben never turned down their invitations, and actually often called them up himself and suggested parties. Finally, they moved to Albany on account of Mr. Buckley's business. We missed them a great deal, and when Mrs. Buckley wrote for us to come up there for the holidays, well, we were tickled pink. Well, their guest room was terribly cold. It took hours to fill the bathtub. There was no reading lamp by the bed. And 3 reporters called to interview Ben. 2 of them kittenish young girls. The breakfasts were just fruit and cereal and toast. Coffee was not served at luncheon. The faucets in the wash basin were the kind that won't run unless you keep pressing on them. 4 important keys on the piano were stuck, and people were invited in every night to hear Ben play. The Buckley family had been augmented by a tremendous police dog who was just a puppy and never growled or snapped at anyone he knew. Yeah, but he couldn't seem to remember that Ben was not an utter stranger. On the 4th awful day, Ben gave out the news, news to him and to me, as well as to our host and hostess, that he had lost a filling, which he did not trust any but his own New York dentist to replace. And we came home. And we have never seen the Buckleys since. If we do see them, it'll be an accident. I mean, they'll hardly ask us there unless we ask them here. And we won't ask them here for fear that they'll ask us there. And they were honestly the most congenial people we ever met. It was after our visit to the Craigs at Stamford that Ben originated what he calls his emergency exit. We had such a horrible time at the Craigs and such a worse time getting away that Ben swore he would pay no more visits until he could think of a graceful method of curtailing them in the event that they proved unbearable. Now here's the scheme he hit on. He would write himself a telegram and sign it with the name Ziegfeld or Gene Buck or Dillingham or George M. Cohan. The telegram would say that he must return to New York at once, and it would give a reason. Then, the day we started out, he would leave it with Irene, the girl at Harms, his publishers, with instructions to have it sent to him 24 hours later. And when it arrived at whatever town we were in, he would either have the host or hostess take it over the telephone or ask the telegraph company to deliver it so he could show it around. And we would put on long faces and say how sorry we were, but of course business was business, so goodbye, and so forth. There was never a breath of suspicion, even when the telegram was ridiculous, like the one Ben had sent to himself at Spring Lake, where we were staying with the Marshalls just after Betty's birthday opened at the Globe. The Marshalls loved musical shows, but knew less than nothing about music and swallowed this one whole. Shaw and Miss Miller both suffering from laryngitis. Stop. Entire score must be rewritten half tone lower. Stop. Come at once. Stop. C.B. Dillingham. If, miraculously, Ben had ever happened to be enjoying himself, he would, of course, have kept the contents of his message a secret, or else displayed it and remarked swaggeringly that he guessed he wasn't going to let any so-and-so theatrical producer spoil his fun. Well, Ben is in Atlantic City now, and I have read every book in the house. And I'm writing this just because there doesn't seem to be anything else to do. And also because we have a friend, Joe Frazier, who's a magazine editor, and the other day I told him I would like to try my hand at a short story. But I was terrible with plots. And he said plots weren't essential. Look at Ernest Hemingway. Most of his stories have hardly any plot. It's his style that counts. And Mr. Frazier, suggested that I write about our visit to Mr. and Mrs. Thayer in Lansdowne, outside of Philadelphia, which, Mr. Frazier said, might be termed the visit that ended visits, and which is the principal reason why I am here alone. Well, it was a beautiful night a year ago last September. Ben was conducting the performance Step Lively, and I was standing at the railing of the boardwalk in front of the theater, watching the moonlight on the ocean. A couple whom I had noticed in the hotel dining room stopped alongside of me, and pretty soon the woman spoke to me, something about, how pretty it was. And then came the old question. Wasn't I Mrs. Ben Drake? I said I was, and the woman went on. My name is Mrs. Thayer, Hilda Thayer, and this is my husband. We're both crazy about Mr. Drake's music and just dying to meet him personally. We wondered if you and he would have supper with us after the performance tonight. Oh, I'm afraid that's impossible, I replied. You see, when they're having a tryout, he and the librettist and the lyric writers work all night, every night, until they get everything in shape for the New York opening. They never have time for more than a sandwich, and they eat that right in the theater. Well, how about luncheon tomorrow? You'll be rehearsing all day. How about dinner tomorrow evening? Honestly, Mrs. Thayer, it's out of the question. Mr. Drake never makes engagements during a tryout week. And I guess he doesn't want to meet us anyway, put in Mr. Thayer. What use would a genius like Ben Drake have for a couple of common no-count admirers like Mrs. Thayer and myself? If we were somebody, too, it would be different. Not at all, said I. Mr. Drake is perfectly human. He loves to have his music praised, and I'm sure he would be delighted to meet you if he weren't so terribly busy. Well, can you have lunch with us yourself? Tomorrow? Any day. Well, whatever Ben and other husbands may think, there is no decent way of turning down an invitation like that. And besides, I was lonesome, and the Thayers looked like awfully nice people. I lunched with them, and I dined with them, not only the next day, but all the rest of the week. And on Friday I got Ben to lunch with them, and he liked them too. They were not half so gushing and silly as most of his fans. At dinner on Saturday night, they cross-examined me about our immediate plans. I told them that as soon as the show was over in New York, I was going to try and make Ben stay home and do nothing for a whole month. "Well, I should think," said Mrs. Thayer, "it would be very hard for him to rest there in the city with the producers and publishers and phonograph people calling him all the time." I admitted that he was bothered a lot. "Listen, dearie," said Mrs. Thayer, "why don't you come to Lansdowne and spend the week with us? I'll promise you faithfully that you won't be disturbed at all. I won't let anyone know you're there, and if any of our friends call on us, I'll pretend we're not at home. I won't allow Mr. Drake to even touch the piano. If he wants to exercise, there are miles of room in our yard to walk around in, and nobody can see him from the street. All day and all night he can do nothing or anything just as he pleases. It will be Liberty Hall for you both. He needn't tell anybody where he is, but if some of his friends or business acquaintances find out and try to get in touch with him, well, I'll frighten them away. How does that sound?" It sounds wonderful," I said. "But that settles it then," said Mrs. Thayer. "We'll expect you on Sunday, October 11th. "Oh, but the show may not be set by that time," I remonstrated. "Well, how about the 18th?" said Mr. Thayer. Well, it ended by my accepting for the week of the 25th, and Ben took it quite cheerfully. "If they stick to their promise and keep us under cover," he said, "it may be a lot better than staying in New York. I know that Buck and the Schuberts and Ziegfeld want me while I'm hot, and they wouldn't give me a minute's peace if they could find me. And, of course, if things aren't as good as they look, Irene's telegram will provide us with an easy out." On the way over to Philadelphia, he hummed me an awfully pretty melody which had been running through his head since we left the apartment. "I think it's Surefire," he said. "I'm crazy to get to a piano and fool with it." "Well, that isn't resting, dear." "Well, you don't want me to throw away a perfectly good tune. They aren't so plentiful that I can afford to waste one. It won't take me 5 minutes at a piano to get it fixed in my mind." The Thayers met us in an expensive-looking limousine. "Ralph," said Mrs. Thayer to her husband, "you sit in one of the little seats, and Mr. and Mrs. Drake will sit back here with me." "Oh, I'd really prefer one of the little seats myself," said Ben, and he meant it, for he hates to get his clothes mussed, and being squeezed in between two such substantial objects as our hostess and myself, well, it was bound to rumple him. "No, sir," said Mrs. Thayer positively. "You came to us to rest, and we're not going to start you off uncomfortable. But I honestly, really..." It was no use. Ben was wedged between us, and throughout the drive maintained a morose silence, unable to think of anything but how terrible his coat would look when he got out. The Thayers had a very pretty home, and the room assigned to us was close to perfection. There were comfortable twin beds with a small stand and convenient reading lamp between, a big dresser and chiffonier, an ample closet with plenty of hangers, a bathroom with hot water that was hot, and towels that were not too new, and faucets that stayed on when turned on, and an ashtray within reach of wherever you happened to be. If only we could have spent all our time in that guest room, it would have been ideal. But presently we were summoned downstairs to luncheon. I had warned Mrs. Thayer in advance, and Ben was served with coffee. He drinks it black. "Don't you take cream, Mr. Drake?" "No, never." "Oh, that's because you don't get good cream in New York." "No, it's because I don't like cream and coffee." "Oh, you would like our cream. We have our own cows, and the cream is so rich, it's almost like butter. Won't you try just a little?" "No, thanks." "But just a little, to see how rich it is." She poured about a tablespoon of cream into his coffee cup, and for a second I was afraid he was going to pick up the cup and throw it in her face. But he kept hold of himself and forced a smile and declined a second chop. "You haven't tasted your coffee," said Mrs. Thayer. "Yes, I have," lied Ben. The cream is wonderful. I'm sorry it doesn't agree with me." "Well, I don't believe coffee agrees with anyone," said Mrs. Thayer. "While you're here, not doing any work, why don't you try to give it up?" I'd be so irritable you wouldn't have me in the house. Besides, it isn't plain coffee that disagrees with me. It's coffee with cream. "Pure rich cream like ours couldn't hurt you," said Mrs. Thayer, and Ben, defeated, refused to answer. He started to light a Jaguar cigarette, the brand he had been smoking for years. "Here, wait a minute," said Mr. Thayer. "Try one of these." "What are they?" asked Ben. "Trumps," said our host, holding out his case. "They're mild and won't irritate the throat." I'll sample one later," said Ben. "Oh, no, you've simply got to try one now," said Mrs. Thayer. "You may as well get used to them, because you'll have to smoke them all the time you're here. We can't have guests providing their own cigarettes." So Ben had to discard his Jaguar and smoke a Trump, and it was even worse than he had anticipated. After luncheon, we adjourned to the living room, and Ben went straight for the piano. Here, none of that," said Mrs. Thayer. "I haven't forgotten my promise." "What promise?" asked Ben. "Didn't your wife tell you? I promised her faithfully that if you visited us, you wouldn't be allowed to touch the piano." "But I want to," said Ben. "There's a melody in my head that I'd like to try." "Oh, yes, I know all about that," said Mrs. Thayer. "You just think you've got to entertain us. Well, nothing doing. We invited you here for yourself, not to enjoy your talent. I'd be a fine one to ask you to my home and for a rest and then make you perform." "You're not making me," said Ben. "Honestly, I want to play for just 5 or 10 minutes. I've got a tune that I might do something with, and I'm anxious to run it over." "I don't believe you, you naughty man," said our hostess. "Your wife has told you how wild we are about your music, and you're determined to be nice to us. But I'm just as stubborn as you are. Not one note do you play as long as you're our guest." Ben favored me with a stricken look, mumbled something about unpacking his suitcase — it was already unpacked — and went up to our room, where he stayed nearly an hour, jotting down his new tune and smoking Jaguar after Jaguar, and wishing that black coffee flowed from bathtub faucets. About 4:15, Mr. Thayer insisted on taking him round the place and showing him the shrubbery, something that held in Ben's mind a place of equal importance to the grade of wire used in hairpins. "I'll have to go to business tomorrow," said Mr. Thayer, "and you'll be left to amuse yourself, so I thought you might enjoy this planting more if you knew a little about it. Of course, it's much prettier in the spring of the year." "Yeah, I can imagine so." "Well, you must come over next spring and see it. I'm usually busy in spring," said Ben. "Before we go in," said Mr. Thayer, "I'd like to ask you one question. Do tunes come into your mind and then you write them down? Or do you just sit at the piano and improvise until you strike something good?" "Sometimes one way and sometimes the other," said Ben. "That's very interesting," said Mr. Thayer. "I've often wondered how it was done. And another question. Do you write the tunes first and then give them to the men who write the words? Or do the men who write the words first and then give them to you to make up the tunes to go with them?" "Sometimes one way and sometimes the other," said Ben. "That's very interesting," said Mr. Thayer. "It's something I'm glad to know. And now we'd better join the ladies, or my wife will say I'm monopolizing you." They joined us, much to my relief. I had just reached the point where I would either have had to tell Hilda exactly how much Ben earned per annum, or else tell her it was none of her business. "Well," said Mrs. Thayer to Ben, I was afraid Ralph had kidnapped you." He was showing me the shrubbery," said Ben. "What did you think of it?" "Oh, it's great shrubbery," said Ben, striving to put some warmth into his voice. "Well, you must come and see it in the spring. Now, I'm usually busy in the spring. Ralph and I are mighty proud of our shrubbery." "Well, you have a right to be." Ben was taking a book out of the bookcase. "What book is that?" asked Mrs. Thayer. "The Great Gatsby," said Ben. "I've always wanted to read it, but I've never got around to it." "Oh, heavens!" said Mrs. Thayer as she took the book from him. "That's old. You'll find the newest ones there on the table. We keep pretty well up to date. Ralph and I are both great readers. Just try any one of those books in that pile. They're all good." Ben glanced them over and selected chevrons. He sat down and opened it. "Man, exclaimed Mrs. Thayer, "you've picked the most uncomfortable chair in the house." "He likes straight chairs," I said. "That's on the square," said Ben. "But you mustn't sit there," said Mrs. Thayer. "It makes me uncomfortable just to look at you. Here, take this chair here. It's the softest, nicest chair you've ever sat in." "I like hard, straight chairs," said Ben, but he sank into the soft, nice one and again opened his book. "Oh, you never can see there," said Mrs. Thayer. "You'll ruin your eyes. Just get up a minute and let Ralph move your chair by that lamp." I could see perfectly well. "I know better." "Ralph, move his chair so he can see." I I don't believe I'm going to read just now anyway, said Ben, and went to the phonograph. Ah, Bess, he said, putting on a record. Here's that "Oh, Miss Hannah" by the Revellers. Mrs. Thayer fairly leaped to his side and herded Miss Hannah back into her stall. "Oh, we've got lots later ones than that," she said. "Let me play you the new Gershwins." And it was at this juncture that I began to suspect our hostess of a lack of finesse. Now, after all, Gershwin is a rival of my husband's, and, well, in some folks' opinion, a worthy one. However, Ben had a word of praise for each record as it ended, and did not even hint that any of the tunes were based on melodies of his own. "Mr. Drake," said our host at length, "would you like a gin cocktail or a Bacardi?" I don't like Bacardi at all," said Ben. "I bet you'll like the kind I've got," said Mr. Thayer. "It was brought to me by a friend of mine who just got back from Cuba. It's the real stuff." "I don't like Bacardi," said Ben. "Wait till you taste this," said Mr. Thayer. Well, we had Bacardi cocktails. I drank mine, and it wasn't so good. Ben took a sip of his and pretended it was all right, but he had told the truth when he said he didn't like Bacardi. I won't go into the details regarding the dinner, except to relate that 3 separate items were highly flavored with cheese. Ben despises cheese. "Don't you care for cheese, Mr. Drake?" asked Mr. Thayer, noticing that Ben was not exactly bolting his food. "No," replied the guest of honor. "Oh, he's spoofing you, Ralph," said Mrs. Thayer. "Everybody likes cheese." There was coffee, and Ben managed to guzzle a cup before it was desecrated with pure cream. We sat down to bridge. "Do you like to play families or divide up?" We like to play together," said I. "I'll bet you don't," said Mrs. Thayer. "Suppose Ralph and you play Mr. Drake and me. I think it's a mistake for husbands and wives to be partners. They're likely to criticize one another and say things that leave a scar." Well, Mr. Thayer and I played against Ben and Mrs. Thayer, and I lost 60 cents at 1/10 of a cent a point. Long before the evening was over, I could readily see why Mrs. Thayer thought it was a mistake to play with her husband. And if it had been possible, I'd have left him with a complete set of scars. Just as we were getting to sleep, Mrs. Thayer knocked on our door. "I'm afraid you haven't covers enough," she called. "There are extra blankets on the shelf in your closet." "Thanks," I said. We're warm as toast." "I'm afraid you aren't," said Mrs. Thayer. "Lock the door," said Ben, "before she comes in and feels our feet." All through breakfast next morning we waited in vain for the telephone call that would yield Irene's message. The phone rang once, and Mrs. Thayer answered, but we couldn't hear what she said. At noon, Ben signaled me to meet him upstairs, and there he grimly stated that I might do as I choose, but he was leaving Liberty Hall ere yet another sun had set. You haven't got any excuse," I reminded him. "I'm a genius," he said, "and geniuses are notoriously eccentric." "Well, geniuses' wives sometimes get eccentric too," said I, and began to pack up. Mr. Thayer had gone to Philadelphia, and we were alone with our hostess at luncheon. "Mrs. Thayer," said Ben, do you ever have premonitions or hunches?" She looked frightened. "Why, no. Do you?" "I had one not half an hour ago. Something told me that I positively must be in New York tonight. I don't know whether it's business or illness or what, but I've just got to be there." "That's the strangest thing I ever heard of," said Mrs. Thayer. It scares me to death." "It's nothing you need to be scared of," said Ben. It only concerns me." "Yes, but listen," said Mrs. Thayer. "A telegram came for you at breakfast time this morning. I wasn't going to tell you about it because I'd promised that you wouldn't be disturbed, and it didn't seem so terribly important, but this hunch of yours, it puts matters in a different light. Oh, I'm sorry now that I didn't give you the message when I got it, but I memorized it, and I can repeat it word for word. Mr. Ben Drake, care of Mr. Ralph Thayer, Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. In Nile song, second bar of refrain, bass drum part reads A flat, which makes discord. Should it be A natural? Would appreciate your coming to theater tonight to straighten this out, as harmony must be restored to orchestra if troupe is to be a success. Regards, Jean Buck." It sounds silly, doesn't it?" said Ben. "And yet I have known productions to fail and lose hundreds of thousands of dollars just because an author or a composer left town too soon. Well, I can well understand that you consider the message trivial, and at the same time I can thank my stars that this instinct or divination, or whatever you will call it, told me to go home." Just as the trainmen were shouting "Board," Mrs. Thayer said, "I have one more confession to make. I answered Mr. Buck's telegram. I wired him, 'Mr. Ben Davis resting at my home. Must not be bothered. Suggest that you keep bass drum still for a week.' And I signed my name. Please forgive me if I've done something terrible. Remember, it was for you." Small wonder that Ben was credited at the Lambs Club with that month's most interesting bender.